photography students. So I'm just going to do a couple different edits for our light painting project and how we can kind of play with colors and different parts of our photos. So these are some I took up grade 2 of Corey, and so I just want to kind of share how we can adjust the files to kind of bring out the different lighting effects. So I do always recommend work on a duplicate copy. So if you right click or control click and then make a copy. So if you right click, you can choose the duplicate option and make a copy. And again, you can always change the name of these. You know, sometimes I prefer to work in version 2, 3, 4. So I'll call this V2. And so I will right click on the photo and choose open in camera raw. So obviously you can play with your exposure and kind of see what it does when you play with your overall exposure. So you maybe shot it too bright or too dark. For this photo, the flash came on, but it didn't light it up a lot. So I'm just going to bring up the shadows a little bit just to kind of see Corey a little better. And then depending on how bright your light was in your exposure, you could play with the brightness of your highlights or the whites. So you can obviously adjust those two and how you want them to show up. Obviously, if you bring up the clarity, you can play with that as well. So maybe I'll do some kind of lower texture, but bring up the clarity, just kind of bring that out. And then obviously play with the colors. So the ones I want to talk about is for changing your colors. I would get into your color grading. And so the color grading option will let you put different colors in different areas. So if I want to change the color of the white in the light, I can increase the saturation of my highlights and kind of adjust this around. Where I get to see the color better is actually to bring that down, so the brightness of the highlights, and then I can go in and start playing with the colors and changing those out. So I could do like a blue edit. Obviously I can add a separate color to the shadows as well, you know, to kind of give it a cool effect as well. So I can kind of play with each of those independently. Let's maybe do, so kind of like the analogous color, kind of the purple with the blue looks good. Alright, and again you can play with the brightness of those, which is kind of nice here. There we go. So this photo, because I gave it a little extra room, I would recommend, you know, cropping to your subject, right? And depending on how you shot it, you know, removing parts of the background. You can obviously go in and use the healing brush tool and get rid of, you know, unwanted parts as well too, and, you know, delete those out. So always make sure to open these into Photoshop and then save them out. So I'm just going to go File Save. Oh, it's already V2, so I'm just going to make sure, oh sorry, I have my mode set to 16-bit, so always make sure in 8-bit for saving for JPEG. And then let's save this out as a JPEG. V2, I'm just going to place it and hit OK in my quality. Let's do 11. So for other photos, like this one, it kind of made it too bright in my exposure. So I should have adjusted the camera. But obviously, if you go back into your details, you can play with the clarity. But what I would do is go into your highlights and just kind of see how the highlights and the whites kind of affect it. Maybe you can bring back some details in those. And then again, you can go into your color grading and add in. So I'm just going to bring down my whites and then bring this up. You can kind of see how it can affect the colors pretty well. And then if I add, you know, vibrance and saturation to it, it should kind of bring those colors out too, which looks pretty nice. So obviously, you know, open them and save them. The other method I was going to show is actually in Photoshop. Oops, sorry, I need to switch my mode to 8-bit mode, 8-bit, and save, and JPEG. Just going to place in it, okay? So the other method in Photoshop, so I'm just going to, let's grab this one. I'm just going to make a copy and then open that just straight into Photoshop. So if you go into your adjustment layers down here, you can go into, there's a couple different ways you can change colors. One is the select color option. And if you go into, so it should default to reds. So you got to click on reds and then choose your whites. And make sure it's set to absolute, or relative is a little weaker, absolute is a little more. So if you start moving these sliders, you'll see how it kind of affects the colors, especially going to the right. You can also make it lighter or darker. And so you can kind of play around with the sliders and kind of just see how it affects the colors. And you can definitely play with them a lot. If I hit relative, it's going to change the amount, so it's not as strong. But if I hit absolute, it works pretty well. Another way of doing this is you could go into your hue saturation. Actually, let's go into solid color. So what I'm going to do is go into solid color adjustment layer. And let's say I want to make these like red. And so obviously I can go in and change my blending mode, and that'll apply to the whole photo. So let's maybe try overlay, looks good. Usually the ones that work best will be soft light or overlay. Sometimes multiply looks cool. Actually, maybe I'll leave it here. It looks kind of good. And so then, I can double click on the color and I can change the color, right? So I can keep, adjusting the color. I can go less saturation, more saturation, brighter and darker, right? When I kind of move it around. Then what I can do, if I don't want it on, certain parts of my photo, like in my shadows, I can double click or right click on the right side, so not on the name, but just right of the name here. So control click or right click, and go to the top and choose blending options. So in blending options, I'm going to go to the layer, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to drag it to where it kind of comes off. Actually, let's go to, is it this layer? Here we go. So the underline layer, and I'm just going to hold down the Option or Alt key and kind of separate it. So now it'll only be attached just to my whites, and then I can kind of play with, where it kind of extends to the glow, and then how much it affects. But you can kind of fine tune it to where it can either attach just to your highlights or just to your shadows. You can kind of play with that too. And again, you can keep adjusting, your blending modes and your opacity, because it is on an adjustment layer. You can control all those different aspects. You can lower or increase the opacity. So I actually liked it where, let's go back into my steps. It was here. I think that looks pretty good. And then, I can play with my levels and adjust my exposure, right? I can kind of play with that and kind of keep adding adjustment layers. Now I need to kind of crop it, so I'm just going to use my crop tool and crop it like that. Looks good. And then if you want to bring out details in Photoshop, so I'm just going to go to Layer and then flatten my layers together, like so. So Layer, Flatten Image, and then just duplicate your layer. Hit OK, and then you can obviously go in and do a high pass filter to kind of bring out, you can sharpen it up, or you can kind of bring, different kind of highlights and adjustments. Just make sure to change your blending mode to either soft light, overlay, or hard light. Looks kind of good in hard light. And again, you can reduce the opacity so it's not as intense. And then you can kind of bring in details that way too with the high pass mode. Always finish out with layer, flatten image, and then just go File, Save As. This one's a copy, so I'm just going to save and replace, and then hit OK on the quality and save that out. So that's how you can adjust colors for light painting and bring out details as well. Alright guys, thanks for watching.